She turned to look at Galt, knowing that he was the man against whom she had had no help to offer. He sat at the wheel of the car. He had not followed her or moved to assist her, as if he had wanted her to acknowledge the past, and had respected the privacy of her lonely salute. She noticed that he still sat as she had left him, his forearm leaning against the wheel at the same angle, the fingers of his hand hanging down in the same sculptured position. His eyes were watching her, but that was all she could read in his face, that he had watched her intently, without moving. When she was seated beside him once more, he said, "That was the first man I took away from you." She asked, her face stern, open, and quietly defiant, "How much do you know about that?" "Nothing that he told me in words. Everything that the tone of his voice told me whenever he spoke of you." She inclined her head. She had caught the sound of suffering in the faintest exaggeration of evenness in his voice. He pressed the starter. The motor's explosion blasted the story contained in the silence, and they drove on. The path widened a little, streaming toward a pool of sunlight ahead. She saw a brief glitter of wires among the branches as they drove out into a clearing. An unobtrusive little structure stood against a hillside on a rising slant of rocky ground. It was a simple cube of granite the size of a tool shed. It had no windows, no apertures of any kind, only a door of polished steel, and a complex set of wire antennae branching out from the roof. Galt was driving past, leaving it unnoticed, when she asked, with a sudden start, "What's that?" She saw the faint break of his smile. "The powerhouse." "Oh, stop, please." He obeyed, backing the car to the foot of the hillside. It was her first few steps up the rocky incline that stopped her, as if there were no need to move forward, no further place to rise, and she stood as in the moment when she had opened her eyes on the earth of the valley, a moment uniting her beginning to her goal. She stood looking up at the structure, her consciousness surrendered to a single sight and a single wordless emotion. But she had always known that an emotion was a sum totaled by an adding machine of the mind, and what she now felt was the instantaneous total of the thoughts she did not have to name, the final sum of a long progression, like a voice telling her by means of a feeling. If she had held on to Quentin Daniels, with no hope of a chance to use the motor, for the sole sake of knowing that achievement had not died on earth, if, like a weighted diver sinking in an ocean of mediocrity, under the pressure of men with gelatin eyes, rubber voices, spiral-shaped convictions, non-committal souls and non-committing hands, she had held, as her lifeline and oxygen tube, the thought of a superlative achievement of the human mind. If, at the sight of the motor's remnant, in a sudden gasp of suffocation, as a last protest from his corruption-eaten lungs, Dr. Stadler had cried for something, not to look down at, but up to, and this had been the cry, the longing and the fuel of her life. If she had moved, drawn by the hunger of her youth for a sight of clean, hard, radiant competence, then here it was before her, reached and done, the power of an incomparable mind given shape in a net of wires sparkling peacefully under a summer sky, drawing an incalculable power out of space into the secret interior of a small stone hovel. She thought of this structure, half the size of a boxcar, replacing the power plants of the country, the enormous conglomerations of steel, fuel, and effort. She thought of the current flowing from this structure, lifting ounces, pounds, tons of strain from the shoulders of those who would make it or use it, adding hours, days, and years of liberated time to their lives, be it an extra moment to lift one's head from one's task and glance at the sunlight, or an extra pack of cigarettes bought with the money saved from one's electric bill, or an hour cut from the workday of every factory using power, or a month's journey through the whole open width of the world on a ticket paid for by one day of one's labor, on a train pulled by the power of this motor, with all the energy of that weight, that strain, that time, replaced and paid for by the energy of a single mind, who had known how to make connections of wire, follow the connections of his thought. But she knew that there was no meaning in motors or factories or trains, that their only meaning was in man's enjoyment of his life, which they served, and that her swelling admiration at the sight of an achievement was for the man from whom it came, for the power and the radiant vision within him which had seen the earth as a place of enjoyment, and had known that the work of achieving one's happiness was the purpose, the sanction, and the meaning of life. The door of the structure was a straight, smooth sheet of stainless steel, soft, lustrous, and bluish in the sun. Above it, cut in the granite, as the only feature of the building's rectangular austerity, there stood an inscription: "I swear by my life and my love of it, that I will never live for the sake of another man, nor ask another man to live for mine." She turned to Galt. He stood beside her. He had followed her. He had known that this salute was his. She was looking at the inventor of the motor, but what she saw was the easy, casual figure of a workman in his natural setting and function. She noted the uncommon lightness of his posture, a weightless way of standing that showed an expert control of the use of his body, a tall body in simple garments, a thin shirt, light slacks, a belt about a slender waistline, and loose hair made to glitter like metal by the current of a sluggish wind. She looked at him as she had looked at his structure. Then she knew that the first two sentences they had said to each other still hung between them, filling the silence, that everything said since had been said over the sound of those words, that he had known it, had held it, had not let her forget it. She was suddenly aware that they were alone. It was an awareness that stressed the fact, permitting no further implication, yet holding the full meaning of the unnamed in that special stress. They were alone, in a silent forest, at the foot of a structure that looked like an ancient temple, and she knew what rite was the proper form of worship to be offered on an altar of that kind. She felt a sudden pressure at the base of her throat. Her head leaned back a little, no more than to feel the faint shift of a current against her hair, but it was as if she were lying back in space against the wind, conscious of nothing but his legs and the shape of his mouth. He stood watching her, his face still, but for the faint movement of his eyelids drawing narrow as if against too strong a light. It was like the beat of 3 instants. This was the first, and in the next she felt a stab of ferocious triumph at the knowledge that his effort and his struggle were harder to endure than hers. And then he moved his eyes and raised his head to look at the inscription on the temple. She let him look at it for a moment, almost as an act of condescending mercy to an adversary struggling to refuel his strength. Then she asked, with a note of imperious pride in her voice, pointing at the inscription, "What's that?" "It's the oath that was taken by every person in this valley but you," she said, looking at the words. "This has always been my own rule of living. I know it. But I don't think that yours is the way to practice it. Then you'll have to learn which one of us is wrong." She walked up to the steel door of the structure with a sudden confidence faintly stressed in the movements of her body, a mere hint of stress, no more than her awareness of the power she held by means of his pain, and she tried, asking no permission, to turn the knob of the door. But the door was locked, and she felt no tremor under the pressure of her hand, as if the lock were poured and sealed to the stone with the solid steel of the sheet. "Don't try to open that door, Miss Taggart." He approached her, his steps a shade too slow, as if stressing his knowledge of her awareness of every step. "No amount of physical force will do it," he said. "Only a thought can open that door. If you tried to break it down by means of the best explosives in the world, the machinery inside would collapse into rubble long before the door would give way. But reach the thought which it requires, and the secret of the motor will be yours, as well as—" it was the first break she had heard in his voice, "as well as any other secret you might wish to know." He faced her for a moment, as if leaving himself open to her full understanding, then smiled oddly, quietly, at some thought of his own, and added, "I'll show you how it's done." He stepped back. Then, standing still, his face raised to the words carved in the stone, he repeated them slowly, evenly, as if taking that oath once more. There was no emotion in his voice, nothing but the spaced clarity of the sounds he pronounced, with full knowledge of their meaning. But she knew that she was witnessing the most solemn moment it would ever be given to her to witness. She was seeing a man's naked soul, and the cost it had paid to utter these words. She was hearing an echo of the day when he had pronounced that oath for the first time, and with full knowledge of the years ahead. She knew what manner of man had stood up to face 6,000 others on a dark spring night, and why they had been afraid of him. She knew that this was the birth and the core of all the things that had happened to the world in the 12 years since. She knew that this was of far greater import than the motor hidden inside the structure. She knew it, to the sound of a man's voice pronouncing in self-reminder and rededication, "I swear by my life and my love of it, that I will never live for the sake of another man, nor ask another man to live for mine."